Good evening.
Tonight's headline, South Vietnam surrenders and the Communists occupy Saigon. We have dramatic film of the evacuation of Americans and Vietnamese from Saigon. A former South Vietnamese official tells of secret U.S.-South Vietnamese agreements. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger says he will ask Congress for funds to care for as many as 70,000 Vietnamese refugees. And tonight's comment on the future of Indochina. Harry?
The Viet Cong flag is flying over the presidential palace in Saigon today, just a few hours after the South Vietnamese government announced its unconditional surrender. The Provisionary Revolutionary Government gave Saigon a new name, Ho Chi Minh City. The PRG says it will follow a policy of peace and non-alignment in its foreign policy. And it says a general amnesty will soon be decreed. But it has said little else in the brief period since the surrender. We now have films of the emergency evacuation effort from Saigon, which took place just before the surrender. Kevin Delaney reports.
We all knew the evacuation of Americans was near, but it still hit us with surprising suddenness. Early in the day, a voluntary evacuation was quietly announced by the American embassy. Our ABC News team decided to ignore it and wait until we were ordered out. Then in mid-morning, the word was put out. Everyone was told to report to the assembly points right away. There would be only one evacuation, as the situation was turning desperate for the South Vietnamese military. The largest group of newsmen headed for the nearby collection point on Ya Long Street, and the first few busloads went smoothly, with a U.S. Marine captain giving crisp orders to the evacuees.
On board the United States Naval aircraft carriers offshore, okay?
Yes, but how are we getting to the helicopter?
Oh, well, they're going to come in and pick us up from points around Tan Son Nhut.
Around Tan Son Nhut?
Yes.
How much baggage, Captain?
Will you please, one small handbag. Can we please board the bus,
Yes,
ladies and gentlemen?
Then whole families of Vietnamese started arriving at the assembly point, and they were determined to join the evacuees. Vietnamese who had come this close were not going to be left behind. While waiting for his bus, ABC's Ken Kashwahara spoke to Wally Hendrickson, an American nuclear physicist who was unable to get out his Vietnamese.
While here, I met my friend's widow, who I've known about for some 10 years.
Vietnamese friend.
Oh, yes. We went to school together at Washington State University. I was very concerned.
About reprisals to the family, so I turned to help them if I could, and I couldn't get anyone out. The widow was gotten out earlier through embassy help, but not the others.
Maybe they'll be all right.
I don't know. They're pretty good targets. They're worth for the Americans, some in intelligence, some as language instructors.
Cameraman Tony Hiroshiki and I arrived at Tan Son Nhut Airfield to find it still under attack by Viet Cong units, and with U.S. Marines fanning out to protect the evacuation effort. Exploding shells and small arms fire provided a constant background for the arrival of group after group. Not only were the Marines in the act, this Air Force sergeant was doing his best to move his Vietnamese charges to safety. Finally, they roared into view. Big U.S. Marine helicopters, the Jolly Green Giants, and one could sense the soaring confidence of the evacuees that they were going to exit from Vietnam. The choppers began loading up, and then after about 3 hours, it was our turn to run for the helicopter. Marines surrounded the chopper pad with guns at the ready. And finally, the Jolly Green Giant flew its way skyward and rapidly out of range of Viet Cong missiles bracketing the airport. As Saigon disappeared, the enormity of the event registered on the faces of the 60 aboard, Americans and Vietnamese alike. Most were just stunned, but some broke down at the realization they were probably leaving Vietnam forever. The helicopter passed over small fleets of boats leaving the coastal city of Vung Tau, more fleeing Vietnamese. Then, 30 miles from the coast, a beautiful sight, the flight deck of the carrier Midway. Choppers were disgorging Americans and Vietnamese, people who clearly showed the emotional and physical strain of the recent weeks. Ambassador Graham Martin stepped from a Marine helicopter onto the deck of this ship early today and in effect closed the final American chapter on Vietnam. When this correspondent asked him what his feelings were, Martin would only say that he was hungry. Kevin Delaney, ABC News, on the command ship Blue Ridge in the South China Sea.
This is Bill Mildyke. The Vietnam evacuation had started before the U.S. Marines left the ships in the South China Sea. Vietnamese were fleeing to the ships on every available transport. Loads of men, women, and children were appearing all the time during evacuation day on the decks of the command ship. They were searched on arrival for the many weapons they had in their possession. The weapons were thrown overboard. However, the Navy was caught by surprise by the way many Vietnamese finally reached the U.S. ships. Perhaps the greatest indication of panic was the continual arrival of virtual fleets of stolen helicopters. Choppers were flashed into the sea on arrival, blades still whirling, the people diving for safety. The blades of the helicopters were flying in all directions, and the sea was full of aircraft, no longer of any use to the Vietnamese. As the helicopters buzzed the command ship, the Navy tried to decide what to do with the planes that managed to land on the decks. It was finally decided to tip them into the sea. The arrival of the fleets of helicopters was only part of the continued evacuation efforts mounted by Vietnamese who felt they must leave. Virtually any transport that could be found was used in the days leading up to the final evacuation. With some degree of luck, no one was killed in the panicked flights. But this was the story of Evacuation Day. Panic in the faces of the people, and a final chapter to the Vietnam story. Bill Mildyke, ABC News, reporting.
Wire service reporters who stayed behind in Saigon were able to file reports today, and here is part of the story they told. The first communist forces entered the city at mid-morning. An advance column of tanks moved swiftly to the presidential palace and smashed down the gates by force. Government troops removed their uniforms and switched to civilian clothes all over town. A police colonel approached an army war memorial, saluted, and then shot himself. Truckloads of regular communist troops began appearing throughout the city. A victory parade developed down the main street. People began to appear on the sidewalks. Several hundred applauded the communist troops. There were small pockets of resistance in some parts of the city, but generally the takeover of the city was peaceful. The Viet Cong said that fighting continued in provinces west of Saigon. There had been widespread looting when the Americans left. The U.S. Embassy was ransacked. According to one reporter, when the communists entered the city, the looting stopped.